Today I want to talk about kind of what I left off with at the end of the last episode, which was I talked about illusory form and then kind of leading into the nighttime practices. So I'm gonna do a little bit of a step back to get some perspective and then talk about kind of the overall practice and then kind of get into details. I'm going to split this into two episodes. The first one is going to be kind of an overview. We'll see how far we get. And then the second one is going to be getting into more details. All right, so to begin with, I want to talk about what I've learned in the last 9 months about. I was working on illusory form for probably a year straight before taking a break from that. Um, I started looking into the origins of illusory form. I started looking into the larger context of Tibetan Dream Yoga, Tibetan Buddhism, which also known as Vajrayana, and I started looking into the context. So the first place that a lot of my research I do on the internet, through Google, YouTube, and then I also, um, a really great way to do research is through the bibliographies of books. And I'll just, you know, get a good book and then look through their bibliography where they're getting their sources and then kind of follow that trail of sources. So I've gotten information from whole bunch of different places, um, and one of the first things that I came across was something called the Six Yogas or Six Dharmas of Naropa, and that really helped me put things in context. And then I started learning about the history of Tibetan Buddhism, and I started learning about where all these teachings came from, and that also helped put it into perspective as well. So, the six yogas of Naropa talk about, it's kind of a developmental process, which is kind of set within the larger context of Vajrayana Tibetan Buddhism. Um, it's a really long process. There's a lot involved in those practices, and even in the practice of Vajrayana itself, there's a lot of foundational preliminary practices that are part of that journey. Um, so the six yogas of Naropa um, begins with Tumo, goes to Karma Mudra. I'm sorry, I'm using the Glenn Mullen book, by the way, Glenn Mullen translation. So there are different setups. Um, Naropa was kind of this apparent genius, and he put together the six. So it's a Tumo, Karma Mudra, Illusory Body, Clear Light, um, Bardo. I think I'm missing one. Let's see. I'll just look at it here in the book. So we've got the Inner Heat Yoga, which is Tumo, Karma Mudra, Illusory Body Yoga, the Bardo Yoga, the Clear Light Yoga, the Consciousness Transference Yoga, and the Forceful Projection Yoga. So that's seven, but I think the one of them is not included in the count. Obviously, I think that might be the um, the consciousness transference yoga may just be kind of touched on. Um, Either that, or one of the last two, they're either combined or just kind of touched on. The main ones is the first one, the inner heat yoga, and the karma mudra. Of course, those are the foundational practices for the rest of the yogas. And before that, there's a bunch of preliminaries. Um, so, from what I've learned, I should preface this by saying I'm not an expert in this. Um, what I'm talking about should not be taken as authoritative from an expert. I'm getting my information from YouTube, from books, from I get my information from teachers, but I still lack a lot of the overall context of there's many different schools in Tibetan Buddhism alone, not to mention the other three main areas of overall Buddhism. Um, I'm starting to get into learning about kind of the larger picture of Buddhism. Um, I'm working on a book that goes through Sravakayana, um, Mahayana, and Vajrayana, and kind of those are seen as like the three vehicles. And I'm working on learning kind of the context of all that. So I know a lot of basics, but I still lack a lot of the nuanced knowledge and a lot of the basic knowledge of Buddhism itself. Um, Kind of the stuff that what you're supposed to learn initially. Because I came at this through Dream Yoga, I didn't learn the philosophy and ideology of Buddhism first. Instead, I learned the practices of Tibetan Dream Yoga from Tenzin Wangyal Rinpoche, and then kind of expanded from there. And the reason why I decided to expand my view is because I realized my practice was insufficient to contain the experience of illusory form in the way that I was practicing it. I was practicing it very strictly. I was um, following the format that Tenzin Wangyal Rinpoche includes in his book, and I was practicing it very diligently and intensely. Um, and I had kind of passed over a couple important pieces in the book because I wanted to focus in on what I felt was the effective practices, or at least what I thought were, to me, self evidently useful exercises. So, the one thing that I passed over, which was probably not a good idea to pass over, was the guru yoga practice. And, a guru doesn't necessarily have to be a um, a person that you're meeting face to face. When you think about, I often compare spiritual work to like learning a trade. I worked professionally as a baker for a while, a couple years, maybe like 2.5 years, and it's very similar in that you can't learning on your own is extremely difficult and time consuming. And basically you might get to the level of a professional on your own. It's possible. But you would I mean the intensity and the devotion that you would have to have is pretty crazy. And even then you still um, may not reach the same level as you would if you had just gone and learned from already accomplished bakers, for example. I've heard stories of accomplished bakers um, learning on their own, but even, the one I have in mind, kind of a famous baker, um, they learned mostly on their own, but even they had, went to workshops. They went and tried to learn from local bakers. They, you know, even even though they were kind of doing their own thing, they were still reaching out and trying to connect with experts in that field, right? So, without going into all of the benefits of that and that whole thing, the main thing with Guru Yoga, in my opinion, is it has for me. I started using Tenzin's um, Guru Yoga exercise in his book, Tibetan Yogas of Dream and Sleep, and I used my own personal chosen guru. It doesn't have to be a person. I've heard it said from lamas that you can use an archetype. Um, you know, People have a lot of different opinions on this. I'm sure a lot of people out there would say I'm totally wrong. You absolutely need a in-person physical guru that can see what's going on in you, and give you the right advice. Um, and that, it's there's different value that you're getting from these different approaches. And then again, you may not even be able to access a guru, a teacher in person. Anyway, so this practice in the book, I have found that it is grounding for me when I'm feeling. In the previous episode, I talked about how illusory form had caused feelings of derealization and depersonalization, where I felt like I was disconnected from everything around me. I felt like I was in a dream, and I felt like I was floating in the air, and I just felt really discombobulated. And I go into more detail in the previous episodes, but um, I started trying to um, visualize clear light, to kind of remind myself that um, this feeling of dread was itself part of the dream, and that does work. But I found that Guru Yoga works even, well, maybe in a different way, equally effectively. Maybe combining them both is probably the most ideal way. And what I found was that it really grounded me. Um, and I'm not sure why, but it works for me. And so that it works. Um, and so I've kind of slowly started to work my way back into practicing illusory form more and more intently. And when I get those feelings of derealization or depersonalization, I switch over to um, visualizing my guru, and that is kind of a balance that I've found. Um, I'm also I took a break from reading the Six Yogas of Naropa because I realized um, they are actually part of a more advanced stage in a typical path. So in what I've learned is that you have the generation stage or creation stage, and then you have the completion or perfection stage. And um, all of these six yogas of Naropa, technically speaking, are part of the perfection stage, whereas the generation stage is like the pre-preliminaries where you're learning about the philosophy and ideology of Buddhism, where, as they say, you're developing the right view. I'm not going to go into all that detail. Um, and then the preliminaries, which are, these sets of practices that you're meant to do over the course of several months or years, where you're repeating the same practice um, tens of thousands of times, up to 100,000 times. And then you're going to um, deity yoga, um, and then into the perfection stage practices of the rest of those yogas. So I'm still learning about the whole, how it all fits together and how I want to proceed personally. But for today, I wanted to talk about kind of what I was talking about last time, where, you know, illusory form kind of leads into the other practices. And I wanted to talk about those practices and then kind of in the second episode get more into detail. So essentially what we have in the format of the Tibetan Yogas of Dream and Sleep, you have this section where it talks about the four foundational practices. I'm going to talk about that, but I want to talk about that within a context of um, essentially all these practices in all the books I've read are broken into four time frames. You have morning practice, you have daytime practice, you have pre-sleep practice, and you have nighttime practice. Okay. So the daytime practice would be illusory form, among other things, but that's the main thing. And by the way, illusory form is also known as illusory body yoga, which can be found in the 6 yogas of Naropa. The practices in the Tibetan yogas of dream and sleep are kind of the basic imagine everything is a dream. Um, that crosses over into lucidity or into your dreams, producing lucidity. In the 6 yogas of Naropa, it goes into more depth on particular meditations that you do at the beginning of your day and then come back to that throughout the day. Um, Meditating on the illusory nature of reality and illusory nature of your body, excuse me, and then coming back to that throughout the day. Um, so I haven't gotten into that yet. I haven't decided whether I'm ready for that or not. Um, I'm I, I'm I'm kind of debating on what foundation I need and how much time I'm going to put into building that foundation in order to get deeper into those practices. Because I do have a job, I do spend a lot of time focusing on my job. Whereas, if I had all of my time to spend to just practice, it would be a lot more simple where I could, focus in on the preliminaries and do those and then move on to the rest in a relatively short period of time. You can do the preliminaries in a matter of 6 months, 6 to 9 months, whereas, having a job, I can only devote a certain amount of time to it during the day, so then it would take me a lot longer to get through those. So then it's a question of um, do I want to spend 3 years doing just those and not doing any of the illusory body yogas, that sort of thing. So I'm still working that out in my mind. But so you've got the illusory form during the day, and then there's a few pre-sleep practices. So the pre-sleep practices, um, I've personally split them uh, into the first being reviewing my day, which is one of the four foundational practices um, in the Tibetan yogas of dream and sleep. And that's remembering memories from the day and imagining them as if they were lucid dreams. And I'm just going to go ahead and open this up here real quick and just go through the um, make sure I'm getting these 4 foundational practices correct. And so that's the first one that I do. I recall my day as if it's a lucid dream. The second one I do is set an intention. So that would be essentially that would be the let's see here. So we've got the third is reviewing the day before going to sleep and strengthening the intention to practice during the night. So that's the third foundational practice. And then I transition into visualizing either Lotus. I'm working on the more complex Lotus visualization. Um, so in the Tibetan Yogas of Dream and Sleep, we've got an illustration here of um, the 4 petals and a white A at the throat. So you're meant to visualize a 4-petaled lotus. Okay, so he does talk here about 4 petals. On each of the 4 petals is a syllable, and those are seed syllables of Tibetan seed syllables, or Tibetan letters. I'm not exactly clear on that. I was researching that yesterday, actually. And then, so what they're saying here is visualize these syllables in rotation, 4 of them for each one on each petal, making 4, and then the A in the middle. Says, as sleep comes, maintain a light, relaxed focus on the A. All right, so that's the kind of practice in the Tibetan Yogas of Dream and Sleep. Andrew Holacek has a similar practice, but using different letters. So I was looking at that yesterday as well, and let me just take a look at that. And what he's got here is a 4-petaled lotus, red lotus, with Tibetan seed syllables, a and then these petals are different colors, and he's using some of the same letters or syllables, and then a couple different syllables, and then instead of an A in the center, he's using an Om in the center. And then there's another book that I have that has a completely different visualization. Not a completely different, it's a lotus flower with the 4 petals and then a symbol in the middle, and each petal has a seed syllable, and each of those symbols have a very large kind of meaning of their own, and that's kind of the most complex one that I've seen. So I've been just this week kind of looking deeper into the meanings of that. So, and that kind of touches on my priorities, which is my priority is to practice first. And that has gotten me into a little bit of trouble, practicing first and studying later. However, it's also given me confidence that it gives me confidence that I'm on the right track, or at least on an effective track. Maybe right isn't really a useful word. And so I tend to learn this stuff very slowly and mostly focus on practice time. So I'm mostly focused on my meditation and my dream yoga practices. So instead of visualizing the 4 syllables on the lotus, I've just been visualizing the lotus just by itself, or I've just been visualizing a white Tibetan Ah, or a Tibetan A symbol in my heart. That's another, I believe that's in the Namkhai Norbu book. And So that's kind of my pre-sleep, and that's been a bit of a challenge because a lot of times I'll get stuck in the remembering my day, and I'll get kind of swept away in the imaginings, the visualizing my memories. Um, so that's always something I'm constantly working on. So that's kind of the pre-sleep practices. Um, I've found that the intention setting is super important for me, especially for getting vivid dreams and lucid dreams. And then we have the nighttime practices, uh, and those are basically in lucid dreaming community would be called a wake back to bed. Um, and it's basically you're meant to wake up every 2 hours and do a visualization. The 2 hours after you fall asleep, 2 hours after that, and another 2 hours after that. It's based on an 8 hour time block of sleep. So um, I'll probably go into detail of those practices in the next episode, but just in general, wake back to beds are extremely effective for me and for a lot of people in producing higher awareness during sleep. And being able to wake up naturally without an alarm is a big, a big help. So, personally, the way I did that was by drinking a lot of water before I went to bed. And that would force me to get up during the night. And for a long time, I just went right back to sleep. But after doing that for several weeks, I started to be more aware as I fell asleep. And this depends a lot on the person because some people have a harder time falling asleep than others. It's kind of a spectrum there, one way or the other. Whether it's easy for you to fall asleep or it's hard for you to fall asleep, and you kind of have to adjust your methods, your techniques based on how your body works, how your mind works, and kind of work with it. Uh, so those awakenings are super helpful. Um, and then the fourth and final time is the morning. Um, and so in the Tibetan Yogas of Dream and Sleep, we've got the fourth foundational practice is engaged upon awakening in the morning. It further cultivates strong intention and also strengthens the capacity to remember the events of the night. So, you know, you're essentially waking up in the morning, you're thinking about your dreams, you're remembering your dreams, and if they were non lucid, then you're imagining them as lucid dreams. And if you did have lucid dreams, the book says feel joy at the accomplishment. You know, I think any amount of awareness, and Tenzin says this as well, any amount of awareness should be appreciated, and any increased awareness should be appreciated. Um, and so in the morning, doing that first thing in the morning is a really good idea. Um, and just having the intention of doing that in the morning is already prepping your mind. It's a prospective memory exercise. Prospective is intending to remember something in the future, and so prospective memory doesn't just affect you when you're meant to remember something. It also affects your behavior um, from now until then. Um, so when I talk about prospective memory, I think about times when I knew I had to wake up for something. Whether that was a job interview or waking up to go fishing early in the morning or waking up to get my presents on Christmas, when I knew that I had to do something, I would fall asleep differently and I would wake up differently. And so that's kind of this effect certain types of expectation has on you and prospective memory. Um, I know that, like, if you're stressed about something the next day, you may have a harder time falling asleep and you may wake up earlier. You may not get great sleep. So the emotional state of our mind has a big effect on how we sleep, and um, kind of doing these exercises in the morning and really investing positive emotion into the experiences you've just had during the night is a big um, there's a reason he calls it a foundational practice, because all these practices are building a foundation, um, and that is what I wanted to talk about mostly, which is that all of these practices create a kind of web. Um, so, the number one foundational practice in the Tibetan Yogas of Dream and Sleep, he calls it changing the karmic traces. And essentially, what he's talking about is reality checks. Um, and what he's also talking about, he says, a version of the first foundational practice is rather well known in the West, because dream researchers and others interested in dream have found. And by the way, he says he doesn't say the dream or dreams. He I forget what the grammar word for this is, but he says because dream researchers and others interested in dream have found that it helps to generate lucid dreaming. Um, I like how he uses the word dream as kind of referring to all of sleep, kind of our perceptive experience of sleep. He doesn't say dreams as if it's like separated chunks of perception. He's seeing the experience of sleep as a whole experience, which he calls dream. But also, waking life is also dream. Um, it's just a different mode of perception, right? Um, he says, it is as follows: throughout the day, practice the recognition of the dreamlike nature of life until the same recognition begins to manifest in dream, right? So you can see how he uses the word dream again. Until the same recognition begins to manifest in dream. So he doesn't say in dreams. And when he talks about it live, like when I've watched videos of him talking or live teaching, he intentionally uses the word dream that way. He doesn't split it up into dreams. He talks about it, um, our entire experience as dream. Okay. And the reason why is because it's all a projection. Um, yeah, I think it's helpful to think about it in terms of scientific correlates, but also the science is still quite limited in its ability to describe uh, what's going on. And so while I do think it is helpful to talk about science in this context, I think this tradition has gone way, way beyond where we're at in science, in terms of experience. And so we are able to experience much, much, much more than what science has been able to explain. These words like real, reality, truth, what is true, what is real, those words don't really mean much. Um, it's in our time, everybody thinks that what they are experiencing is real. And in a certain sense, that's true. However, there's also a sense in which You know, there's a certain philosophy that says that only what science has observed is real. Um, Only what is measurable is real. And I think both of those views are true, right? So these words, real, reality, true, kind of start breaking down. Um, so anyway, so this first foundational practice um, is basically reality checks. And what a lot of I'll probably get more into this um, in the next episode, but it's uh, typically reality checks are seen initially by new lucid dreamers as kind of mechanical actions that one does, which will then lead to a predictable result. So you put the quarter into the machine, spits out a gumball, right? You do 2 plus 2, out comes 4. So that's kind of our default way of thinking about life in the West. In the U.S. anyway, I can't really speak for Europe, but um, you know, when you're learning, I, I always think about my time at the bakery because when I was there, I'm a very self-reflecting person, self-conscious, um, and self-consciousness can go negative or positive, and I'm always very aware of my movements, and the head baker there it was very similar, and so it was a really great working relationship. And I was working with some of the other more advanced bakers there and asking them questions about, like, well, how are you doing this? How are you doing this? Well, the nature of that work is it's extremely experiential, where you're doing something and you're trying it so many times and you're repeating it so many times, hundreds, thousands of times, to where instead of thinking about what you're doing, it's a direct line to your body, and all you're doing is adjusting the movements of your body and then just like hammering that home, just doing that same movement over and over and over again, right? And so what that does is it creates muscle memory, and not only that, but it it does all this stuff that we don't even understand. But um, you're not thinking about it, is my point. And so when I would ask them, what are you doing there? They're like, well, I don't know. I've never thought about what I was doing there. And then they would think about it, and then they would mess up um, because those are two different modes that we have of interacting with the world. It's actually much more effective to interact through experience, repeated experience over and over and over and over and over again, rather than attempting to think about it and break it down into things that you can describe, right? So and just to get a little bit of an aside into maybe the philosophy of science, I think we tend to misunderstand what science is sometimes, because science that actually has been able to measure things has been doing just endless repetition of tests, endless repetition of hypothesis and test, just experiments over and over and over again. And we kind of nowadays, I don't know why. I could say uh, why I think maybe why, but I'm not entirely sure. But we kind of have this idea that a study comes out and they say, oh, researchers found this, right? Um, and that we're finding this replication crisis where a large number of apparently scientific studies cannot be replicated. And that's like the whole thing, right? Like it's supposed to be able to be replicated. And the interesting thing about, going back to the bakery, every single piece that was shaped, every single loaf that was made was slightly different. Every single one. Now, somebody who just was coming in to buy bread wouldn't know the difference. They're like, yeah, unless there was a big change, they're pretty much all the same. But somebody who's been, in the back, the people who are actually making the bread, they can look at 5 loaves of the same bread, and to the layperson, they're all the same, but to the expert professional baker, you can see tons of difference, all kinds of difference. Um, and that's mainly because there's so much variation in all the things that go into making that bread. So, um, in terms of thinking about what you're doing and experience, kind of that repetition is really where it's at. And so when you're doing a reality check, kind of coming back full circle, it's really more about repetition. It's when you're talking about experience, it's much more about just doing it over and over and over again and seeing what works. The tricky part, the difference here is at the bakery, I had professionals watching me and helping me improve and get better. And there was a lot of people, very skilled people, that were not able to do that. And we were trying to bring in new people, and it didn't work out, even though they had this full system of support. Um, and so, you know, I guess that kind of makes it sound a little like intense, like really hard. And it just depends on what level you're going for. So if you're just looking to make some bread at home, you don't need professional training, right? You really just need a recipe. And then you'll probably screw it up a few times, but eventually you'll get it right, right? If you're trying to make professional grade bread day in, day out, you're going to need structure, you're going to need processes, you're going to need records, you're going to need to keep a record, you're going to need professionals helping you. You're going to need the whole gamut to make it work. Um, and there are bakers that work alone. um, there's somebody in Seattle, and hopefully he's still around. The virus has made things tricky, but he basically would make maybe like 40 loaves a day for this cafe downtown, and then people could pick up a certain amount up until like 11 a.m. and he would just sell out every day. So, you know, I I really enjoy the metaphors or the analogy between baking and a spiritual life, because there are so many useful metaphors there. Um, Flour, water, salt, the holy trinity of of uh, of bread making. It's really a lot about repetition and learning through experience. And you can talk about it all day long, but until you get your hands dirty, you haven't learned anything. And I really enjoy that aspect of trades, like learning the trades. So those are essentially the the 4 practices. I wanted to talk about the web of memory. And yeah, I'm getting kind of sidetracked a lot. That's what I do. But I think what I'm going to do is kind of introduce the next episode, and then we'll get more into the details of these individual time frames and their practices. So, in terms of creating a web, Tenzin Wangyal, he talks about creating a bridge between waking and sleeping, and he talks about these practices um, being effective in creating that bridge and kind of, in a way, breaking down the barrier between waking and sleep. Um, and I think that is exactly what happened for me. However, I think of it more as a web um, than than as a bridge, because I think it's going. The reason why I think of it as a, and I'm not to say that this is like instead of seeing it as a bridge. It's just the way I see it, and so it's not, you know, I'm just saying how I see it. So the reason why I call it a web is because you're sending intention and prospective memory into the future, and then once you get to the future or the now, you're reaching back into the past and bringing that into the now as a way to reach again into the future. And I'll explain what I mean, and then we'll go ahead and wrap up the episode, and then I'll get more into detail in the next one. So what I mean by that is the daytime practice of illusory form, or this kind of illusory form reality check. You're imagining things as a dream, right? So you're doing that. Then, before you go to sleep, you're looking back at your day. You're imagining as a dream. But a lot of times, my memory goes to those moments when I was practicing the illusory form, or it'll go to moments of increased awareness, heightened awareness, heightened emotion, heightened attention, um, some kind of raised state. Um, I've learned that the pre-sleep practice for me is done best if I just kind of let my mind go to something, and then I'll latch onto that and kind of dig into it and try to remember more of that situation. Um, and then, um, when you wake up at night, you're visualizing these specific symbols. Um, you're creating yet another kind of connection to your practice at night as you're going to sleep. You're tapping into that mindset of lucidity, where some practices are kind of meant to build up your your reserves of energy, or your intention, or your kind of lucidity, and then there's other exercises that are meant to tap into that reserve and utilize what you've kind of built up, right? So um, as you're doing that throughout the day, throughout the night, when you get up in the morning, you're imagining non-lucid dreams as lucid. You're just continually attaching this mindset of lucidity to like all of your memories. And you're just like creating these threads in every direction until all of your time, day and night, is completely meshed together in this lucid mindset. I think that, as far as what I've found, that is what really makes the dream yoga practice effective. Um, so I went a little longer than I thought I would, but I'm going to go ahead and end it there. And then in the next segment, I am going to talk about the practices in a little bit more detail and just my experience with them. All right, thank you for listening to my podcast, and hope it was enjoyable. And I'll see you next time.